My brother Nathaniel stole my $1.2 million inheritance while I was planning our mother's funeral, forged her signature on documents that didn't exist, and when I confronted him in our childhood home in Millbrook Valley, he smirked and said, "Mother always loved me more anyway. She would have wanted me to have it all." But what Nathaniel didn't know was that I had found the real will hidden in Mother's jewelry box, and it was about to destroy everything he thought he'd won. I'm Charlotte Peterson. I'm 35 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I thought the worst thing I'd ever face was watching my mother, Eleanor Peterson, take her final breath after a 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer. I was wrong. The worst thing was discovering that my own flesh and blood, the brother I'd protected and defended my entire life, had been planning to rob me blind the moment Mother's heart stopped beating. For 6 months, I'd been the one sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs, holding Mother's hand through chemotherapy sessions that left her weak and nauseated. I'd been the one taking time off from my marketing consulting firm in Riverside Heights to drive the 2 hours to Millbrook Valley every weekend, bringing her favorite lavender tea and reading her the romance novel she could no longer hold herself. Nathaniel, meanwhile, was always too busy with his real estate ventures in the city. Always had an excuse, always promised to visit next weekend. But he made sure to visit plenty when I wasn't around. Mother had always been the heart of our family. After Dad died when I was 16 and Nathaniel was 22, she'd worked double shifts as a nurse to keep us afloat, never once complaining about the sacrifice. She'd saved every penny she could, invested wisely, and built a modest fortune through careful planning and decades of discipline. The Peterson family home in Millbrook Valley, where we'd grown up, sat on 12 acres of prime land that developers had been eyeing for years. Combined with her life insurance, investments, and savings, Mother's estate was worth $1.2 million, a fortune to someone like me who'd been building her business from scratch, still paying off student loans and living in a small apartment in the city. The day after Mother's funeral, I was emotionally drained, surrounded by casserole dishes from well-meaning neighbors and drowning in sympathy cards. The house felt impossibly empty without her warm laugh echoing through the kitchen or her gentle humming as she tended to her prized rose garden. I'd planned to spend the week going through her belongings, treasuring the memories, and slowly beginning the process of settling her affairs. That's when Nathaniel showed up with his lawyer, Gregory Whitman, a sharp-dressed man with cold eyes who barely offered his condolences before spreading documents across Mother's antique dining table. "Charlotte," Nathaniel said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "I know this is difficult timing, but we need to discuss Mother's wishes." I stared at the papers in confusion. According to these documents, Mother had revised her will just 2 months ago, leaving everything, the house, the land, the investments, everything, to Nathaniel. I was mentioned only as receiving her grandmother's china set and $1,000 for sentimental purposes. "This can't be right," I whispered, my hands shaking as I read the signature that looked like Mother's but felt wrong somehow. She would have told me. She would have discussed this with me. Nathaniel exchanged a glance with his lawyer. "Mother was concerned about your financial responsibility, Charlotte, your business struggles, the debt you've accumulated. She felt I was better equipped to manage the family wealth." The words hit me like a physical blow. My business struggles? I'd been transparent with Mother about the challenges of starting my own firm, but she had always been proud of my determination to build something from nothing. She had never, not once, suggested I was financially irresponsible. "She was proud of my business," I said, my voice barely audible. "She bragged about me to her friends. She said I had Dad's entrepreneurial spirit." People change their minds, especially when facing their mortality. Mrs. Peterson made her wishes clear. The will is legally binding and has been filed with the probate court. I felt like I was drowning in that moment, surrounded by the scent of Mother's favorite vanilla candles and the photos of our family covering every surface. How could she have done this? How could she have left me with nothing after I had sacrificed so much to care for her? But Nathaniel wasn't done twisting the knife. Don't worry, Charlotte. He actually patted my shoulder like he was being generous. You can stay in the house for another week to get your things together. After that, I'll need you out so I can begin preparing it for sale. The developers are very interested. Sale? He was going to sell our childhood home, the house where Mother kissed our scraped knees and taught us to make her famous apple pie, the rose garden she'd spent decades perfecting. He was going to let strangers tear it all down for a shopping complex? Nathaniel, please, I begged, hating how desperate I sounded. This house means everything to our family. Mother loved this place. You can't just sell it. He smiled, and for the first time I saw something cruel in my brother's eyes that I'd never noticed before. Mother always loved me more anyway. She would have wanted me to have it all. Those words echoed in my head for hours after they left. I wandered through the house like a ghost, touching Mother's favorite reading chair, running my fingers along the kitchen counter where she taught me to knead bread, staring at the family photos that suddenly felt like lies. But something nagged at me. Mother had been sharp as a tack right up until the end. Even through the pain medication, she'd been making lists, organizing her affairs, asking me specific questions about my business plans and dreams for the future. She'd talked about wanting to help me expand my firm, about how proud Dad would have been. This will didn't sound like her. It didn't feel like her. And that's when I decided to find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. That night, I couldn't sleep in Mother's house. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the oak trees outside her bedroom window felt like her spirit trying to tell me something. I kept thinking about the last real conversation we'd had, just 3 days before she passed, when the morphine hadn't yet clouded her mind completely. She'd gripped my hand with surprising strength, her eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks, and said, "Charlotte, honey, I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens after I'm gone, no matter what anyone tells you, remember that you are my greatest pride. You have your father's heart and my stubborn streak, and that combination is going to serve you well." At the time, I thought she was just being sentimental, the way dying people often become. But now, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, those words felt like a warning. Mother had been meticulous about everything her entire life. She'd kept detailed records of every penny spent, every investment made, every decision that affected our family's future. When Dad died suddenly of a heart attack at 48, leaving us with a mountain of medical debt and a failing hardware store, Mother could have declared bankruptcy and started over. Instead, she'd worked 3 jobs, sold everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, and paid every creditor in full because Petersons honor their debts. It took her 7 years, but she'd not only cleared Dad's debts, she'd managed to save the hardware store by selling it to Dad's business partner, using the proceeds to put herself through nursing school. She'd always said that losing Dad taught her that financial security wasn't just about having money, it was about having options when life tried to knock you down. "Never depend on anyone else for your survival, Charlotte," she'd told me when I'd graduated college. "Build something that's yours, something no one can take away from you." That advice had driven me to start Peterson Marketing Solutions instead of taking the safe corporate job my college career counselor had recommended. For 5 years, I'd scraped by, reinvesting every profit back into the business, living in a studio apartment above a bakery in Riverside Heights because the rent was cheap and the smell of fresh bread reminded me of Mother's kitchen. The business had been growing steadily. Last year, I'd finally been able to move into a 1-bedroom apartment with actual windows, and I'd started putting aside money for the down payment on a small office space. Mother had been so proud when I'd shown her the lease I'd been considering, a cozy spot in the historic district with exposed brick walls and room for 2 employees. "Your father would have loved this," she'd said, running her fingers over the photos on my laptop. "He always said the key to success was finding something you loved and then working harder at it than anyone else was willing to work." But Mother's support had gone beyond just emotional encouragement. 6 months ago, when I'd mentioned struggling to secure a business loan for expansion, she'd quietly offered to co-sign. I'd refused. She'd already sacrificed enough for our family, but she'd insisted on at least reviewing my business plan. "I may be just an old nurse," she'd said with a laugh, "but I know good sense when I see it. And honey, you've got more good sense than most people twice your age."
She'd spent an entire evening going through my financial projections, asking thoughtful questions about my client retention rates, my marketing strategies, my plans for scaling up. She'd even suggested a few contacts from her nursing network who might need marketing help for their private practices. She'd been thinking, she'd said, as we'd sat on her back porch that night, watching fireflies dance around her rose bushes. When I'm gone, I want you to use part of your inheritance to expand the business properly. Not just the office space, but hiring good people, investing in the right equipment, maybe even that advanced certification program you mentioned. I'd protested that I didn't want to think about inheritances, that I wanted her to focus on getting better, but she'd waved away my objections. Charlotte, I'm 73 years old and I have stage 4 cancer. We both know how this ends, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone. Her voice was gentle but firm. I've spent my whole life building something to leave behind for you and Nathaniel, but more than that, I want to leave you both with the tools to build your own legacies.
She'd paused then, looking out at the garden Dad had helped her plant 30 years ago. Your brother has his real estate business, his connections, his natural charm with investors. But you, honey, you have something rarer. You have integrity and vision, and you're not afraid to work for what you want. That's why I know you'll use whatever I leave you wisely. Those words haunted me now as I lay in the darkness. Mother hadn't just been proud of my business, she'd been planning to help me expand it. She'd talked about my future with such confidence, such specific detail about how I'd use the inheritance to grow Peterson Marketing Solutions into something significant. Why would she have revised her will to leave me almost nothing just 2 months later, especially when she'd been talking about helping me grow the business? It didn't make sense with the woman who'd raised me, who'd sacrificed everything to give Nathaniel and me opportunities she'd never had. And then there was Nathaniel himself. We hadn't been close in recent years, but we hadn't been enemies either. He'd built a successful real estate business in the city, specializing in commercial properties and development deals. By his own account, he was doing well. Luxury car, expensive suits, a penthouse apartment with a view of the harbor. So why would he need Mother's inheritance so desperately? Why risk destroying our relationship over money he didn't seem to need? Unless there was something about his financial situation he hadn't been telling anyone. As the first light of dawn crept through the lace curtains Mother had made herself, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth about that will, about Mother's final wishes, and about what had really happened in those last months when Nathaniel had been visiting without me. Because the woman who'd raised me to honor debts and fight for what was right wouldn't have left me with nothing, not without a very good reason. And if there was one thing Eleanor Peterson had taught me, it was that the truth always comes out eventually. You just have to be brave enough to look for it. 3 days later, I was in Mother's bedroom, carefully folding her clothes into donation boxes when I decided to tackle her jewelry collection. She'd never been one for expensive pieces. Most of her jewelry held sentimental value rather than monetary worth. Dad's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, the pearl earrings her own mother had given her, a collection of brooches from church friends over the years. Her jewelry box sat on the antique vanity Dad had restored for their 20th wedding anniversary. It was a beautiful piece, mahogany with intricate carved roses along the edges and multiple compartments lined with faded purple velvet. As I opened each tiny drawer, memories flooded back. Mother letting me play dress-up with her costume jewelry when I was little, teaching me which pieces went with which outfits, explaining the stories behind each brooch and bracelet. The main compartment held her everyday pieces, but I remembered that the jewelry box had a secret drawer. Dad had been so proud of that feature when he'd restored it, showing Mother how the hidden compartment worked by pressing a tiny carved rose in just the right spot. Perfect for your most precious treasures, he'd told her with that boyish grin that had made her blush even after 20 years of marriage. I pressed the rose, and the secret drawer slid open with a soft click. Inside, I expected to find perhaps her wedding ring or a letter from Dad. Instead, my fingers closed around a thick manila envelope, slightly yellowed with age. My heart began to race as I saw my name written across the front in Mother's careful handwriting, "For Charlotte. My final wishes, October 15th. October 15th, just 2 weeks before she passed away, 2 weeks before Nathaniel claimed she'd revised her will to leave me almost nothing. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a legal document, official-looking with raised seals and notarized signatures. As I read the first lines, my legs gave out and I sank onto Mother's bedroom chair, the same chair where she used to sit and brush my hair when I was young. The last will and testament of Eleanor Marie Peterson, the document began, but this wasn't the will Nathaniel and his lawyer had shown me 3 days ago. This was something entirely different. According to this document, Mother had indeed revised her will in October, but not the way Nathaniel had claimed. This will left the family home and 5 acres of land to me, along with 60% of her financial assets, specifically earmarked to help me expand Peterson Marketing Solutions. Nathaniel received 40% of the financial assets and 7 acres of the back property, which he could develop or sell as he chose. But that wasn't the most shocking part. At the bottom of the will was a handwritten note in Mother's shaky but unmistakable script. I have hidden this copy because I fear Nathaniel may try to contest or alter my wishes. Charlotte, you were always the responsible one, the one who stayed, the one who cared. Your father would want you to have the home we built together. Use it well, and remember that my love for you both was equal, but my trust was earned through your actions. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely hold the papers. According to this will, this real will, I wasn't getting just $1,000 and some china. I was inheriting the home I'd grown up in, the land I'd played on as a child, and enough money to turn my small marketing firm into the thriving business Mother had always believed it could become. But if this was the real will, what was the document Nathaniel had shown me? I spread both wills side by side on Mother's bed, comparing them line by line. The fake will, because that's clearly what it was, bore Mother's signature, but now that I was looking closely, I could see the subtle differences. The E in Eleanor was slightly more angular than Mother's usual flowing script. The P in Peterson had a loop that Mother never made in her signature. Most damning of all, the fake will was dated just 3 days before Mother's death, when she'd been heavily sedated and barely conscious. I remembered those final days vividly. Mother hadn't been able to hold a pen, let alone sign legal documents. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, her words slurred by pain medication, her hands too weak to even squeeze mine back when I held them. But the real will, hidden in the jewelry box, was dated October 15th, a day I remembered clearly because it had been one of Mother's last good days. She'd been alert, sitting up in bed, asking me to bring her laptop so she could take care of some final business. I assumed she was updating her address book or writing letters to old friends. I never imagined she was protecting her final wishes from her own son. As the reality sank in, I felt physically sick. My brother hadn't just inherited something that should have been shared. He had actively stolen my inheritance through forgery. He'd created fake documents, forged Mother's signature, and then had the audacity to tell me that Mother would have wanted him to have it all. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I couldn't process it all at once. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate act. This was premeditated theft, planned and executed while Mother was dying, while I was focused on caring for her in her final days. I thought about all those times Nathaniel had visited Mother when I wasn't there. He'd said he was coming to spend time with her, to help with her affairs. Instead, he'd been laying the groundwork for this deception. He probably studied her signature, practiced forging it, maybe even used her personal information to create fake legal documents. And Gregory Whitman, the lawyer who'd presented the fake will with such authority, was he part of this scheme, or had Nathaniel fooled him too? Either way, they'd both sat in Mother's dining room and watched me grieve while they stole everything she'd wanted me to have. I clutched the real will to my chest and sobbed, not just from grief, but from rage. Mother had tried to protect me even from her deathbed, hiding the real will where she knew I'd eventually find it. She knew Nathaniel couldn't be trusted, and she had taken steps to ensure her true wishes would be honored. But now what? Nathaniel had already filed the fake will with the probate court. He'd started the legal process to sell the house. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it completely. I picked up my phone to call the police, then hesitated.
Would they even believe me? Nathaniel's fake will had official seals, notarized signatures, and had already been accepted by the probate court. My real will had been hidden in a jewelry box. Without additional evidence, it might look like I was the one trying to commit fraud. But as I sat there in Mother's bedroom, surrounded by her belongings and holding her true final wishes in my hands, I realized something that gave me strength. Mother hadn't just hidden the real will, she'd left me a roadmap to prove Nathaniel's deception. In the envelope with the will, there were other documents I'd initially overlooked. Bank statements showing Mother's mental competency evaluations from October. Medical records proving she'd been heavily sedated during the dates on Nathaniel's fake will. Even a notarized letter from her doctor stating that she'd been too ill to conduct legal business in her final week. Mother had been building a case against fraud as she was dying. She'd been protecting me in ways I was only now beginning to understand. But I also realized that confronting Nathaniel directly would be a mistake. If he knew I'd found the real will, he might try to destroy evidence or create additional forgeries. I needed to be smart about this, strategic in a way that would honor both Mother's memory and her final wishes. I carefully photographed every document, uploaded copies to a secure cloud storage account, and then called the one person I trusted to help me navigate this nightmare, my college roommate Rebecca, who'd become a lawyer specializing in estate fraud. When she answered the phone, I could barely speak through my tears. "Rebecca, I need your help. My brother stole my inheritance, and I think I can prove it." Rebecca arrived at the Peterson family home within 3 hours of my frantic phone call, her silver sedan crunching up the gravel driveway just as the sun was setting behind Mother's oak trees. She drove straight from her law office in the city, still wearing her sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that meant business.
For the next 2 hours, Rebecca examined every document with the methodical precision that had made her one of the top estate lawyers in the region. She used a magnifying glass to study the signatures, cross-referenced the dates with Mother's medical timeline, and made detailed notes in her legal pad. "Charlotte," she said finally, looking up with grim satisfaction, "this is textbook fraud. The signature analysis alone would be enough to invalidate the fake will, but combined with the medical evidence proving your mother was incapacitated during the alleged signing, and the fact that the real will was executed when she was documented as mentally competent, we have an airtight case." Relief flooded through me, but Rebecca held up a warning hand. "However," she continued, "we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. Your brother has already filed the fraudulent will with probate court and initiated sale proceedings for the property. If we tip him off before we have all our legal protections in place, he might try to destroy evidence or create additional forgeries. What do you suggest? We file an emergency motion to halt all probate proceedings first thing Monday morning. But before we do that, I want to gather one more piece of evidence." She tapped her pen against the legal pad thoughtfully. "I want to confront him directly, get him talking, and see if he'll incriminate himself further." The idea of facing Nathaniel again made my stomach churn, but I knew Rebecca was right. We needed him to reveal more about his scheme, preferably in a way that could be documented. That's why, on Saturday evening, I found myself standing on the front porch of Nathaniel's penthouse building in Harbor District, clutching a small digital recorder in my coat pocket. Rebecca waited in her car across the street, ready to intervene if things went badly. Nathaniel answered his door wearing expensive casual clothes, designer jeans, and a silk shirt that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. His penthouse was exactly what I had expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, modern furniture that looked uncomfortable but impressive, and abstract art that screamed, "I have more money than taste." "Charlotte!" He seemed genuinely surprised to see me. "What brings you to the city? I thought you'd be busy packing up the house." "I wanted to talk to you about Mother's will," I said, stepping inside when he gestured me in. Something doesn't feel right about it. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of wariness crossing his features before he arranged his face into a mask of brotherly concern. I know it's hard to accept, Charlotte. I was surprised too when Mother told me about her decision. When exactly did she tell you? I asked, settling onto his uncomfortable modern couch and pulling out my phone as if to take notes. In reality, I was starting the recording app Rebecca had helped me install. Nathaniel moved to his bar cart and poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, not offering me anything. He took a long sip before answering. It was about a month before she passed. She called me to discuss her concerns about your financial stability. What concerns, specifically? He took a long sip before answering. Your business struggles, Charlotte, the debt you've accumulated, the way you've been living paycheck to paycheck. Mother worried that if she left you a large inheritance, you'd squander it the way Dad squandered the hardware store. The comparison to Dad hit like a slap, and I had to force myself to remain calm. Dad didn't squander at the hardware store, Nathaniel. He got sick and couldn't work. There's a difference. Is there? Nathaniel shrugged, settling into the chair across from me with his drink. The result was the same, financial ruin that Mother had to clean up. She didn't want to see that pattern repeat with you. So she decided to give you everything instead. Not everything, he said with false generosity. You're getting the china set and some money. That's not nothing. I stared at him. This man who shared my DNA but seemed completely foreign to me now. $1,000, Nathaniel? After 35 years as her daughter, after all the care I gave her, you think $1,000 and some dishes is appropriate? His jaw tightened slightly. I think Mother's wishes should be respected, regardless of what we think is appropriate. And you're certain those were her wishes? Of course I'm certain. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor. I was there when she signed the will, Charlotte. I witnessed her final decision. This was interesting. According to the fake will, a notary named James Morrison had witnessed Mother's signature, along with someone called Patricia Wells. Nathaniel hadn't been listed as a witness. You were there when she signed it? I pressed. Well, not physically in the room, he backtracked quickly, but I was at the house that day. Gregory brought the documents, Mother signed them, and it was done. Gregory Whitman? Your lawyer? He's not just my lawyer, Charlotte. He's been handling estate planning for several of my real estate clients. Mother specifically requested him because of his expertise. Another lie. Mother had never mentioned Gregory Whitman to me, and she'd always used Harrison and Associates for her legal needs, the same firm that had handled Dad's affairs years ago. I decided to push harder. I'm just having trouble understanding the timeline, Nathaniel. Mother was so heavily medicated those last few days. When exactly did this signing take place?
Nathaniel's reflection in the window showed a man growing increasingly uncomfortable. I don't remember the exact date. Late October, I think. But the will is dated just 3 days before she died. She was unconscious most of that time. He spun around, and for the first time, I saw a flash of genuine anger in his eyes. Are you questioning Mother's mental competency, Charlotte? Are you suggesting she didn't know what she was doing? I'm suggesting that someone who can barely hold a cup of water might have difficulty signing legal documents. Mother had her lucid moments, he snapped. Just because you weren't there for all of them doesn't mean they didn't happen. Where was I during the signing? How would I know? Probably at your little office, focused on your failing business instead of family. The accusation stung because there was enough truth in it to hurt. I had been working during those final days, taking client calls from the hospital waiting room, trying to keep my business afloat while caring for Mother. But then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. Nathaniel, I said slowly, the will is dated October 28th. That was the day Mother had her final surgery, the day they discovered the cancer had spread to her liver. I was at the hospital with her from 6 in the morning until almost midnight. She was unconscious from anesthesia for most of the day. His face went pale, and he turned back to the window quickly. The dates might be wrong. Legal documents sometimes have administrative errors. Administrative errors in the date of signing? Charlotte, what exactly are you trying to prove here? Are you planning to contest the will? Because I should warn you, that would be a very expensive mistake. Mother's wishes were clear, and any attempt to undermine them would be both costly and futile. The threat was unmistakable, but it also revealed something important. Nathaniel was worried about a contest. If his position was as solid as he claimed, why would he be concerned about me challenging it? I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to understand how my mother could have signed a legal document while she was unconscious in a hospital bed. Nathaniel didn't answer, but his silence was more revealing than any words could have been. As I walked toward the door, he called after me. Nathaniel, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Mother made her decision for good reasons. Fighting it will only hurt both of us and cost you money you can't afford to lose. I turned back to look at him one final time. You know what's funny, Nathaniel? Mother always said the Peterson family honor was built on telling the truth, even when it was difficult. I wonder what she'd think about these administrative errors you mentioned. The look in his eyes, part panic, part rage, told me everything I needed to know. He was guilty. He knew I suspected it. And he was getting desperate. As I walked out of his building into the cool evening air, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I had the upper hand. Monday morning arrived with Rebecca's emergency motion filed with the probate court, but before the legal wheels could fully turn, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Charlotte, dear, this is Vivian Ashford. The voice was warm but shaky, belonging to Mother's oldest friend from the Millbrook Valley Garden Club. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the church directory. Of course, Mrs. Ashford. How can I help you? Well, it's more about how I might help you, sweetheart. I heard through the grapevine about your mother's will, and frankly, it doesn't sit right with me. Eleanor was so proud of you, especially these last few months. She spent our entire last garden club meeting talking about your business and how she planned to help you expand it. My heart started racing. She talked about helping me expand the business? Oh, yes, dear. She said she'd already revised her will to make sure you'd have the resources to grow Peterson Marketing Solutions. She was so excited about your plans for the historic district office space, said she couldn't wait to see her granddaughter running up proper company headquarters someday. Granddaughter? Mother had never had granddaughters, but she'd always talked about my future children as if they were already real to her, already part of her legacy plans. Mrs. Ashford, when was this garden club meeting? October 20th, dear, just 2 weeks before Eleanor passed. She seemed so at peace that day, like she'd gotten all her affairs in order exactly the way she wanted them. October 20th, 5 days after Mother had signed the real will, 8 days before the fake will was supposedly signed while she was unconscious in surgery. But Mrs. Ashford wasn't finished. There's something else, Charlotte. Eleanor asked me to witness something that day. She had me sign a document, said it was a backup copy of her will that she wanted kept safe. I have it right here in my desk drawer if you'd like to see it. My knees went weak. Another copy of the real will with an independent witness who could testify to Mother's mental state and intentions.
An hour later, I sat in Mrs. Ashford's cozy living room examining a perfect copy of the real will I'd found in Mother's jewelry box. Mrs. Ashford had also written a detailed note about the circumstances of the signing, including Mother's clear statements about wanting to ensure Charlotte could expand her business and maintain the family home. Eleanor was worried about something that day, Mrs. Ashford said, pouring tea from her china set, ironically the same pattern as the one I was supposedly inheriting, according to Nathaniel's fake will. She said family relationships could be complicated, and she wanted to make sure her true wishes couldn't be, what was the word she used? Manipulated. Yes, that was it. She was worried about manipulation. Armed with this new evidence, Rebecca and I felt confident about our legal position. But what happened next took both of us completely by surprise. Wednesday afternoon, I received a call from Nathaniel asking me to meet him at Rosewood Country Club, where several of our extended family members were gathering for what he described as a family discussion about Mother's estate. I should have been suspicious, but I was so focused on our legal strategy that I didn't see the trap he was setting. Rosewood Country Club was where the Peterson family had held celebrations for 3 generations: wedding receptions, anniversary parties, graduation dinners. Walking into the private dining room, I expected to see maybe 5 or 6 relatives. Instead, I found myself facing nearly 20 family members, including aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends I hadn't seen since Mother's funeral. They were seated around a large oval table, with Nathaniel at the head like some kind of family patriarch. Gregory Whitman sat beside him with his briefcase open, legal documents spread across the polished mahogany surface. "Charlotte, thank you for coming," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a false warmth that made my skin crawl. "Please, sit down." The only empty chair was at the far end of the table, directly across from Nathaniel but isolated from everyone else. As I took my seat, I noticed that several relatives avoided making eye contact with me. "I've asked everyone here today because there seems to be some confusion about Mother's final wishes," Nathaniel began. "Charlotte has been questioning the validity of Mother's will, and I felt it was important for the family to understand the situation." My face burned with embarrassment. He was framing me as the troublemaker, the ungrateful daughter who couldn't accept Mother's decisions. "The will is very clear," Gregory Whitman said, his voice carrying the authority of legal expertise. "Mrs. Eleanor Peterson revised her testament in October, leaving the bulk of her estate to her son Nathaniel with a modest bequest to her daughter Charlotte. This decision was made with full mental capacity and proper legal witnesses." "But that's not—" I started to speak, but Nathaniel cut me off. "Charlotte, I understand you're disappointed. We all are. None of us expected Mother to make such a decisive choice about the inheritance distribution." The way he said decisive made it sound like Mother had deliberately snubbed me, as if my years of caring for her had somehow proven me unworthy. Uncle Harold, Dad's older brother, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Nathaniel, this seems like a private matter between you and Charlotte. Why involve all of us?" "Because," Nathaniel said, his voice taking on a tone of wounded nobility, "Charlotte has threatened to contest the will. She's hired a lawyer and is preparing to drag our family through a costly public legal battle that will benefit no one except the attorneys." Murmurs rippled around the table. I could see the disapproval in their faces, not for Nathaniel, but for me. In their eyes, I was the one causing family drama, the one who couldn't graciously accept what I'd been given. "Furthermore," Gregory Whitman added, "any contest of this will would be frivolous and potentially subject Charlotte to paying all legal costs for both sides. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees." Aunt Margaret, Mother's sister, spoke up from across the table. "Charlotte, dear, is this really what Eleanor would have wanted, all this conflict and legal fighting?" "What Mother would have wanted," I said, finding my voice, "was for her true wishes to be honored, not—" "Her true wishes are documented in her legal will, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the probate court. Everything else is just wishful thinking." The phrase wishful thinking hit like a physical blow. He was dismissing not just my claims, but my entire relationship with Mother, reducing years of care and love to mere delusion. Cousin Daniel, who had always been close to our family, leaned forward. "Charlotte, I have to ask, have you considered that maybe Eleanor had reasons for her decision that she didn't share with you? Maybe she saw something in your financial situation that concerned you?" "My financial situation?" "Your business struggles," Nathaniel said with feigned sympathy. "Mother was worried about your debt, your inability to secure proper financing for expansion. She felt that a large inheritance might be wasted." The word wasted hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around the table, I could see relatives nodding, accepting Nathaniel's narrative that I was financially irresponsible, that Mother had been protecting her life savings from my poor judgment. "She also mentioned that you'd been pressuring her to co-sign loans for your business. Mother felt uncomfortable about being asked to risk her retirement security for what she saw as risky ventures."
This was a complete distortion of our conversation about the business loan, but presented to family members who didn't know the details, it painted me as someone who had tried to manipulate a dying woman for financial gain. "That's not what happened," I said. but my voice sounded weak, defensive. "Charlotte," said Aunt Ruth, Mother's closest sister, "maybe it's time to accept that Eleanor made her choice and move on with your life. This legal fighting isn't going to bring her back or change what she decided." The shame was overwhelming. These people, my own family, believed I was a greedy, financially irresponsible daughter who couldn't accept her mother's judgment. They saw me as the villain in the story, not the victim. "I think," said Uncle Harold slowly, "that Charlotte should seriously consider whether pursuing this will contest is worth damaging her relationships with the rest of us. Family is more important than money." The implicit threat was clear. If I continued to fight Nathaniel's fake will, I would be ostracized from the Peterson family entirely. Nathaniel smiled across the table at me, an expression of triumph barely concealed behind his mask of brotherly concern. "I hope Charlotte will think carefully about what's best for everyone. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is accept difficult truths gracefully." As I sat there, surrounded by family members who had accepted Nathaniel's lies without question, who saw me as the problem rather than the victim, I realized that this public humiliation had been carefully orchestrated. Nathaniel hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He'd stolen my reputation, my standing in the family, and my right to be believed. But as I looked around that table at the faces of people who should have supported me, who should have questioned Nathaniel's convenient story, I felt something cold and fierce settling in my chest. They wanted to see me as the villain? Fine. But they had no idea what this villain was capable of when she finally decided to stop playing nice. The weeks following the country club humiliation were the darkest of my life. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity, taking on any client who would pay me, no matter how small the project or unreasonable the deadline. Logo designs for startup restaurants, social media management for local boutiques, website updates for dental offices, anything to keep the lights on in my tiny office and food on my table. My routine became mechanical and punishing. I'd wake at 5 a.m. in my cramped apartment above the bakery, the smell of fresh bread now making me nauseous because it reminded me of better times when I'd thought that scent meant home and comfort. By 5:30, I was at my desk with my first cup of coffee, responding to emails from potential clients, editing marketing materials, writing blog posts for businesses that paid me $20 per article. The Peterson Marketing Solutions office I'd been so excited to lease in the historic district remained just a dream now. Without the inheritance Mother had planned to leave me, I couldn't afford the security deposit, let alone the monthly rent. Instead, I worked from a corner table at Joe's Diner most afternoons, buying endless cups of coffee to justify taking up space for hours at a time. But the financial struggle was nothing compared to the social isolation. Word of my greedy behavior at the country club meeting had spread through Millbrook Valley like wildfire. At the grocery store, neighbors who had hugged me at my mother's funeral now avoided making eye contact. Mrs. Patterson from the church flower committee, who had always asked about my business with genuine interest, crossed to the other side of the street when she saw me coming. The worst part was running into family members. 2 weeks after the country club meeting, I encountered cousin Daniel at the hardware store, the same one Dad had once owned. He gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile and made awkward small talk about the weather before excusing himself quickly. Later, through the store window, I watched him make a phone call in his car, probably reporting the encounter to other family members. The message was clear. I had been written out of the Peterson family story, not through death or distance, but through the much crueler method of being declared morally unworthy of belonging. Meanwhile, Nathaniel's social media presence became a daily torture I couldn't stop myself from checking. His Instagram showed a life of increasing luxury and comfort, photos from expensive restaurants with captions about celebrating family and honoring Mother's memory, pictures of him touring luxury real estate properties with remarks about exciting new developments. Most painful of all were the images from the Peterson family home, my childhood home, showing contractors and real estate agents walking through rooms where I'd learned to walk, to read, to dream.
The house was being prepared for sale to a development company that planned to tear it down and build luxury condominiums. Mother's rose garden, where she'd taught me the names of every flower, would become a parking lot. The oak tree, where Dad had hung my swing, would be cut down to make room for a clubhouse. 35 years of Peterson family history would be erased for profit. But the posts that hurt most were the ones showing Nathaniel's apparent philanthropy. He'd started donating to local charities, always making sure to mention that he was honoring Elabor Peterson's legacy of giving. He'd endowed a scholarship at the local nursing school in memory of his beloved mother's dedication to healthcare. He was building a public image as the grieving son who was using his inheritance responsibly, while I was cast as the bitter daughter who couldn't accept her mother's wise decision.
The irony was suffocating. Nathaniel was being praised for his generosity while spending money that should have been partially mine, money that Mother had actually intended for me to use to build something meaningful with my business. 3 weeks into this nightmare, I received an unexpected visitor at Joe's Diner. I was working on a marketing plan for a small accounting firm, my laptop battery dying because I couldn't afford to replace it, when a shadow fell across my table. Charlotte Peterson? I looked up to see a woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a simple wool coat and carried a canvas bag that suggested practicality over fashion. I'm Dr. Helen Morrison from Millbrook Valley Community College. I was a friend of your mother's through the volunteer program. I gestured for her to sit, grateful for any conversation that didn't involve work deadlines or bill payments. I heard about the situation with Eleanor's will, she said carefully, and I wanted you to know that it doesn't match the conversations I had with your mother in her final months. My heart began to race. What conversations? Dr. Morrison pulled out a small notebook from her canvas bag. Eleanor was very specific about her plans for your inheritance. She talked about it constantly during our volunteer meetings. She said she'd revised her will to make sure you could expand your marketing business properly. She even asked me for advice about business incubators and professional development programs you might find useful. When was this? Our last conversation was October 18th, just 3 weeks before she passed. She was so excited about your future, Charlotte. She said watching you build your business from nothing had been one of her greatest joys as a mother. Dr. Morrison flipped through her notebook and found a specific entry. Here's what she told me that day. Helen, Charlotte has her father's vision and my determination. With the right resources, she could build Peterson Marketing into something really significant. I've made sure she'll have what she needs to do exactly that. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they proved what I'd known in my heart all along. Mother had never intended to leave me almost nothing. Her pride in my work, her excitement about my potential, her specific plans to help me expand the business, none of that had been my imagination or wishful thinking. Dr. Morrison, would you be willing to put this in writing? To testify about what Mother told you? She nodded firmly. Eleanor Peterson was one of the finest women I have ever known. If someone is trying to subvert her real wishes, then yes, I'll do whatever I can to help set things right. As she walked away, leaving me sitting alone at the diner table with my dying laptop and cold coffee, I felt something shift inside me. For weeks, I'd been playing defense, trying to survive financially, emotionally, and socially, while Nathaniel controlled the narrative about Mother's death and our family's future. But Dr. Morrison's visit reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for money or property. I was fighting for the truth about Mother's love, her pride in my accomplishments, and her genuine wishes for my future. Nathaniel hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen the validation of everything I'd worked for, everything Mother had believed about my potential. That night, alone in my apartment above the bakery, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to keep playing the role of the defeated daughter, scrambling for survival while Nathaniel enjoyed the fruits of his deception.
I was going to become the woman Mother had raised me to be, someone who fought for what was right, no matter how difficult the battle became. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. It was time to dig deeper into Nathaniel's finances, his business dealings, and his relationship with Gregory Whitman, because something about his sudden wealth and confidence suggested there was more to the story than simple inheritance theft. If Nathaniel wanted to play dirty, I was ready to show him just how ruthless a desperate Peterson woman could become. Mother had taught me to be honorable, but she'd also taught me to be strong. And it was time for Nathaniel to learn the difference between those two things.
But this discovery, while satisfying, created a new problem. If Nathaniel was desperate enough to forge legal documents and steal from his own family, what other lines was he willing to cross? And more importantly, what would happen to the stolen money if his creditors seized his assets before I could prove the will was fake? I needed help, and I needed it from someone with experience investigating financial fraud. That's when I remembered Tom Brennan, a former client who owned a small investigation firm specializing in insurance fraud and corporate misconduct. 2 days later, I sat in Tom's cluttered office in downtown Riverside Heights, surrounded by filing cabinets and computer screens displaying financial data that made my head spin. "Your brother's in deep trouble, Charlotte," Tom said, pointing to a spreadsheet showing Nathaniel's declining financial position over the past year. But here's what's interesting. The timing of his money problems coincides exactly with his increased visits to your mother. Tom had been thorough in his research, pulling credit reports, court filings, and business registration documents. What he'd found painted a picture of a man whose real estate empire had been collapsing since the previous spring. "Look at this," Tom said, pulling up another document. In March, Chen & Associates lost their biggest development deal when environmental issues were discovered on the land they'd already spent $500,000 preparing. In May, 2 major investors pulled out of ongoing projects. By July, your brother was borrowing against his personal assets just to make payroll. And that's when he started visiting Mother more frequently, I said, the pieces clicking into place. Exactly. But here's the really interesting part. Tom opened another file. Gregory Whitman, the lawyer who presented the fake will, he's not just your brother's attorney, he's also a business partner. This was news to me. What do you mean, business partner? Whitman invested $75,000 in Chen & Associates last year through something called Whitman Holdings LLC. According to the partnership documents, he was supposed to receive a 20% return on that investment within 12 months. Tom showed me the contract, which was due to mature just 2 weeks after Mother's death. So if Nathaniel couldn't pay back Whitman's investment, Whitman would have had a financial incentive to help him steal Mother's inheritance. More than that, Tom continued, Whitman's law practice is also in trouble. He's facing potential disbarment over mishandling client funds in another case. A successful estate fraud that netted him a big payoff could have solved both their problems. The conspiracy was larger than I imagined. This wasn't just my brother making a desperate grab for money. It was a coordinated scheme involving a corrupt lawyer who had as much to gain as Nathaniel did. But Tom wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's one more thing, Charlotte. I found records showing that Nathaniel visited Riverside Memorial Hospital 3 times in October, always during evening hours when most staff wouldn't be around." Riverside Memorial? That's not where Mother was being treated. She was at Millbrook General. I know, but Riverside Memorial is where Gregory Whitman's secretary works part-time in the records department. Her name is Patricia Wells. The name hit me like lightning. Patricia Wells was listed as one of the witnesses on Nathaniel's fake will. Tom, are you saying... I'm saying your brother and his lawyer friend had access to official hospital letterhead, witness signatures, and probably medical information they could use to make their forgery more convincing. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They hadn't just forged Mother's signature, they'd created an entire fabricated legal scenario with fake witnesses and medical documentation to support their story. But as devastating as this information was, it also gave me hope, because the more elaborate their fraud had become, the more evidence they'd left behind, and the easier it would be to prove their guilt. Tom handed me a thick folder containing copies of all his findings. "Charlotte, this is enough evidence to not only prove your brother committed fraud, but to send both him and Whitman to prison for several years. We're talking about felony forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of estate assets." As I drove home that evening, my mind was racing with the implications of Tom's investigation. For months, I'd felt like I was fighting ghosts, accusations and legal documents that seemed official but felt wrong. Now I had concrete proof that my instincts had been correct all along. But I also realized that simply having evidence wasn't enough. Nathaniel and Whitman had already filed their fake will with probate court and begun the process of liquidating Mother's assets. The family home was scheduled to close escrow in just 3 weeks, which meant the Peterson family legacy would be gone forever unless I acted quickly. More importantly, I now understood that this case was about much more than money or property. Nathaniel and Whitman had committed serious crimes, and they were planning to get away with it by hiding behind Mother's death and my family's unwillingness to question their story. The next morning, I called Rebecca with Tom's findings. Her response was immediate and decisive. "Charlotte, we're not just filing a will contest anymore. We're filing criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, and we're doing it tomorrow." "Are you sure we have enough evidence?" With Tom's investigation, Mrs. Ashford's testimony, and Dr. Morrison's witness statement, Charlotte, we don't just have enough evidence to win, we have enough evidence to destroy them completely. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew the real battle was just beginning. Nathaniel had spent months building his false narrative and positioning himself as Mother's rightful heir. Now it was time to tear that narrative down, piece by piece, until the truth was all that remained. The Peterson family honor that Mother had valued so highly was about to be restored, no matter what it cost me to make that happen. The morning we filed the criminal fraud charges, I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. Within hours of our legal filing hitting the court system, Nathaniel's desperation exploded into something far more dangerous than I'd anticipated. It started with a phone call at 6:30 in the morning, just as I was getting ready to meet Rebecca at the courthouse for a follow-up hearing. "Charlotte," Mrs. Ashford's voice was shaking on the other end of the line. "Someone broke into my house last night." My blood ran cold. "Are you hurt? Did you call the police?" "I'm fine, dear, but they went straight to my desk, the one where I kept the copy of your mother's will and my written statement about the garden club meeting. Everything's gone, Charlotte. They knew exactly where to look." The implications hit me immediately. Only 4 people knew about Mrs. Ashford's witness testimony: Rebecca, Tom, Mrs. Ashford herself, and me, which meant someone had been monitoring our legal preparations closely enough to know she was a key witness. "Mrs. Ashford, please pack a bag and stay with your daughter for a few days. I don't think this was a random break-in." An hour later, I received another call that made my hands shake. "Charlotte, this is Dr. Morrison from the community college. I'm calling from the hospital. Someone vandalized my office last night, destroyed my computer, my filing cabinets, everything. But the strangest thing was that they seemed to be looking for something specific. They tore apart my volunteer coordinator files, but left expensive equipment untouched." The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified me. Nathaniel wasn't just trying to cover up his fraud anymore, he was systematically attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. This had escalated from financial crime to something that could be classified as witness tampering and obstruction of justice. I called Tom Brennan immediately. "Charlotte, get to a safe place now.
he said without preamble when I explained what had happened. If they're willing to break into witnesses' homes, they're desperate enough to try anything. But surely they wouldn't. Listen to me carefully. Your brother is facing potential federal prison time for what he's done. People do desperate things when they're looking at years behind bars. Don't underestimate what he's capable of. But Tom's warning came too late. When I arrived at my apartment that afternoon after spending the day at Rebecca's office, I found my front door slightly ajar, the lock damaged but still functional, clearly the work of someone who wanted me to know they'd been inside rather than someone trying to hide their presence. My small apartment had been methodically searched. Every file drawer was open, papers scattered across the floor, my computer keyboard turned over, as if someone had been looking for hidden flash drives or documents. But just like with Mrs. Ashford and Dr. Morrison, nothing valuable had been taken. This wasn't robbery, it was intimidation. On my kitchen table, they'd left a message that made my blood freeze. A printout of my business insurance policy with specific clauses about fire damage highlighted in yellow marker. Beside it was a newspaper clipping about a recent warehouse fire in Harbor District that had destroyed several small businesses and left owners financially devastated. The threat was unmistakable. They knew where I lived, where I worked, and they were suggesting that my business could easily suffer a tragic accident if I continued pursuing the case. I called Rebecca immediately, but when she didn't answer, I tried her office number. Her secretary sounded nervous when she told me Rebecca had left early due to a family emergency. That's when my phone rang with a call from Rebecca herself, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Charlotte, they got to my son." "What do you mean?" "Tyler was walking home from basketball practice when a car pulled up beside him. Two men told him his mother was making a big mistake and that she should focus on her own family safety instead of other people's problems." Rebecca's voice was shaking now, Charlotte. "They knew his name. They knew his school schedule, his routine. They followed my 14-year-old son." The escalation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Nathaniel and his accomplices had moved from stealing money to threatening children. They weren't just trying to cover up fraud anymore. They were using terror tactics that bordered on organized crime behavior. I called Rebecca immediately. "Rebecca, I can't let you and Tyler be put at risk because of my case. Maybe I should—" "Don't you dare back down now, Charlotte," she interrupted fiercely. "What they're doing proves we're right and that they're scared. But it also means we need to move faster and hit harder than they expect." That evening, Tom called with news that sent chills down my spine. "Charlotte, I've been monitoring police scanner activity, and there have been 3 accidental fires in the Harbor District over the past month, all targeted small businesses that were facing legal or financial disputes. One was the warehouse mentioned in that newspaper clipping they left you. Are you saying Nathaniel and his people are committing arson?" "I'm saying someone with resources and connections is eliminating problems through intimidation and destruction, and your marketing business could easily be next if they think it will shut you up." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about covering up inheritance fraud. Nathaniel and Gregory Whitman appeared to be part of a network that used intimidation, witness tampering, and property destruction to solve legal problems. The fake will was just one crime in what might be a pattern of similar schemes. But the most chilling realization came when Tom shared his final discovery of the day. "Charlotte, I found something else. Remember how I said Whitman was facing potential disbarment over mishandling client funds? Well, the client who filed that complaint, she died in a house fire 3 weeks ago. Electrical problem, according to the fire marshal's report." The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me physically sick. We weren't just dealing with desperate men trying to cover up a single crime. We were dealing with people who might have been eliminating obstacles and witnesses for months. "Tom, do you think they killed that woman?" "I think we're dealing with people who have shown a pattern of escalating violence when their schemes are threatened. And I think you need to understand that they see you as their biggest threat right now." As I hung up the phone, sitting in my violated apartment with the smell of strangers still lingering in my small living space, I realized that the stakes had changed completely. This was no longer about getting my rightful inheritance back or clearing Mother's name. This was about survival. Mine, Rebecca's, and potentially other innocent people who might become collateral damage, and Nathaniel's increasingly desperate attempts to cover up his crimes. But rather than making me want to retreat, this escalation filled me with a cold, determined rage. They'd moved beyond stealing money to threatening children and burning buildings. They'd shown me exactly what kind of people I was dealing with, and in doing so, they'd made the biggest mistake of their criminal careers. Because now, I wasn't just fighting for justice, I was fighting to protect everyone they might hurt if they were allowed to continue operating. And a woman fighting to protect innocent people is far more dangerous than one fighting just for herself. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of backing down in the face of their escalating threats, I was going to make sure their crimes were exposed in the most public, devastating way possible. If they wanted to play with fire, I was about to show them what it felt like to get burned. My plan to expose Nathaniel's criminal network began with an unexpected ally who walked into Joe's diner at precisely 10:30 in the morning, 3 days after the break-ins. I was working on my laptop, trying to maintain some semblance of normal business operations while my world crumbled around me, when a woman in a federal agent's badge approached my corner table. "Miss Peterson, I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We need to talk." My first instinct was panic. Had Nathaniel somehow convinced federal authorities that I was the one committing fraud? But Agent Martinez's next words changed everything. "We've been investigating Gregory Whitman for the past 8 months as part of a larger probe into estate fraud and witness intimidation. Your case isn't an isolated incident." She sat across from me, pulling out a thick manila folder that looked remarkably similar to the one Tom Brennard had compiled with his evidence. "Gregory Whitman and his associates have been running inheritance fraud schemes across 3 states," Agent Martinez continued. "They target families dealing with terminal illness, forge wills during the chaos of end-of-life care, and use intimidation tactics to silence anyone who questions their documents." "How many families?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 17 that we can prove, potentially dozens more. The pattern is always the same. They identify vulnerable family situations, gain access to financial and medical information, and then execute forged wills that benefit their conspirators. When challenged, they escalate to property destruction and physical threats. Agent Martinez opened her folder and showed me photographs of other victims. Elderly people who had supposedly changed their wills just before dying, leaving everything to distant relatives or business associates who had mysterious connections to Gregory Whitman. Families torn apart by suspicious inheritance disputes. Small businesses that had suffered convenient accidents when their owners asked too many questions. The woman whose house fire I mentioned to Tom Brennan, she wasn't Whitman's only client who died suspiciously. We've identified 3 other cases where key witnesses or complainants suffered fatal accidents or died from sudden medical emergencies. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Mother hadn't just been targeted randomly, she'd been selected as part of a sophisticated operation that had been destroying families and stealing inheritances for years. "Why are you coming to me now?" I asked.
Because your case is the first one where we have living witnesses with documented evidence that can't be disputed or destroyed. Mrs. Ashford's testimony, Dr. Morrison's statements, the medical records proving your mother was unconscious during the alleged will signing. You've built a stronger case than we've seen in any other victim situation. Agent Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. But more importantly, you forced them to escalate their intimidation tactics to a level that's given us probable cause for federal intervention. Breaking into witnesses' homes, threatening children, attempting to destroy evidence, those are federal crimes that fall under our jurisdiction. What do you need from me? We need you to continue your legal case exactly as you have been, but with federal protection for you and your witnesses. We'll provide security for Mrs. Ashford, Dr. Morrison, and Rebecca's family. In return, we need your cooperation in building a case that will shut down their entire operation. Agent Martinez opened another section of her folder, revealing surveillance photographs that made my breath catch. Nathaniel meeting with Gregory Whitman at expensive restaurants. Whitman exchanging envelopes with men I didn't recognize outside law offices. Most shocking of all, a photo of Nathaniel handing cash to a man in coveralls outside a building that was clearly the warehouse that had burned down in Harbor District. We've been watching your brother and his associates for months, but we needed a victim willing to fight back publicly to force them into making mistakes. You've given us exactly what we needed. But Agent Martinez wasn't finished with her revelations. There's something else, Charlotte. Your mother's death may not have been as natural as everyone assumed. My heart stopped. What do you mean? Eleanor Peterson's medical records show that her final decline was unusually rapid, even for someone with advanced pancreatic cancer. Her oncologist noted concerns about sudden changes in her condition that didn't match her previous prognosis. Agent Martinez showed me medical documents I'd never seen before. Communications between Mother's doctors expressing confusion about her sudden deterioration in the final week of her life. We can't prove anything definitive without exhumation and additional testing, but the timing of her death coinciding perfectly with Nathaniel's financial crisis raises significant questions. The suggestion that Nathaniel might have hastened Mother's death was so horrific I couldn't process it immediately. But as the shock wore off, it explained something that had always bothered me. Why Mother's final week had been so different from what her doctors had originally predicted. Are you saying my brother killed our mother? I'm saying we have enough suspicious circumstances to warrant a thorough investigation. And if we're right, it means your case isn't just about inheritance fraud anymore. It's potentially about murder. The weight of this possibility was crushing, but it also filled me with a resolve stronger than anything I'd felt before. If Nathaniel had murdered Mother to steal her money and cover his debts, then every moment I'd spent doubting myself, every family member who'd called me greedy, every sleepless night wondering if I was wrong about the will, all of it had been justified. Agent Martinez spent the next hour outlining the federal investigation strategy. They would continue monitoring Nathaniel and Whitman while providing security for key witnesses. They'd coordinate with Rebecca to ensure our legal case proceeded without interference. Most importantly, they'd build parallel criminal cases against everyone involved in what they now classified as a criminal enterprise. But Charlotte, you need to understand that this is going to get worse before it gets better. When Nathaniel realizes we're closing in on him, his desperation will reach dangerous levels. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Mother's final words to me about being her greatest pride, about the real will she had hidden in her jewelry box, about all the families this criminal network had destroyed before targeting mine. Agent Martinez, they've already threatened children, burned buildings, and possibly murdered my mother. I'm not backing down now, no matter what they do. That afternoon, Agent Martinez arranged a secure meeting with all our key witnesses and allies. Mrs. Ashford, Dr. Morrison, Rebecca's family, and 2 additional FBI agents gathered in a conference room at the federal building downtown. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't fighting alone. I had federal agents who understood the scope of the criminal enterprise, witnesses who were protected and determined to testify, and lawyers who were building an unshakable case. But more than that, I had a support network of people who believed in justice and weren't afraid of men who used fear and violence to get what they wanted. As we planned our strategy for the final confrontation with Nathaniel and his criminal network, I realized that Mother had been right about one thing. The truth always comes out eventually. Sometimes it just needs the right people fighting hard enough to make sure it sees daylight. And now we had exactly the right people for this fight. The federal sting operation was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the Rosewood Country Club, the same location where Nathaniel had humiliated me in front of our entire family just weeks before. The irony was perfect, but the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. Agent Martinez's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would invite Nathaniel to meet me at the country club under the pretense of finally accepting defeat and negotiating the terms of my surrender.
The FBI had already installed recording equipment throughout the private dining room, and federal agents would be positioned as club staff and patrons. We need him to incriminate himself on federal charges. Inheritance fraud is serious, but conspiracy, witness tampering, and potential murder will put him away for decades.
The hardest part was convincing my family to attend what I told them would be my formal apology to Nathaniel and my public acceptance of Mother's will. Uncle Harold, Aunt Margaret, and a dozen other relatives agreed to come, believing they were witnessing my capitulation rather than Nathaniel's downfall. Rebecca had worked with the FBI to ensure every legal detail was perfect. The real will was authenticated by 3 independent handwriting experts. Mother's medical records were certified by federal forensic specialists. Most devastatingly, the FBI had traced the fake will's creation to a document forgery operation that Whitman had used for multiple previous schemes. But the breakthrough that would seal Nathaniel's fate came just hours before the confrontation, when Tom Brennan called with news that made my hands shake. "Charlotte, we found the smoking gun. Nathaniel's cell phone records show he was at Millbrook General Hospital at 3:17 in the morning on October 28th, the exact time Mother's medical chart shows a sudden, unexplained drop in her vital signs." The timeline was devastating. Nathaniel had been in Mother's hospital room during the night when her condition mysteriously worsened. The same night the fake will claimed she'd been lucid enough to sign legal documents. "There's more," Tom continued. "Hospital security footage shows him leaving through a side exit at 4:43 a.m., and Mother was declared dead at 5:15. He was the last person to see her alive." The evidence was now overwhelming. Nathaniel hadn't just forged a will, he'd potentially murdered our mother and then used her death to steal her fortune. Friday afternoon, I arrived at Rosewood Country Club wearing the same black dress I'd worn to Mother's funeral, a symbolic choice that I hoped would remind everyone present what this was really about, honoring Eleanor Peterson's true final wishes. The private dining room was filled with family members who still believed I was the villain in this story. They sat around the same oval table where Nathaniel had systematically destroyed my reputation, their faces showing a mixture of pity and disapproval as they waited for me to publicly admit my greed and delusions. Nathaniel arrived 15 minutes late, accompanied by Gregory Whitman, both men wearing expensive suits and confident expressions. They clearly believed this meeting would end with my complete surrender and their final victory. "Charlotte," Nathaniel said with false warmth as he took his seat at the head of the table, "I'm glad you've decided to be reasonable about Mother's wishes. This is what's best for everyone." I stood slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "You're right, Nathaniel. It's time everyone knew the truth about Mother's wishes." Instead of the surrender speech he expected, I placed a folder on the table and opened it to reveal the real will, Mother's true final testament that left me the family home and 60% of her estate. This is the will Mother actually signed on October 15th, when she was documented as mentally competent and physically capable of writing. It was witnessed by Mrs. Ashford and hidden in Mother's jewelry box because she was afraid someone might try to alter her final wishes. Gasps rippled around the table. Several family members leaned forward to examine the document, their faces showing confusion and growing alarm. Aunt Margaret asked, "Charlotte, what is this? This isn't the will Gregory showed us." "No, it isn't," I replied, my voice growing stronger. "The will Gregory showed you is a forgery. Mother's signature was faked, the witnesses were paid accomplices, and the date on the document corresponds to a day when Mother was unconscious in surgery." Nathaniel's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure.
This is exactly the kind of desperate fabrication I was afraid Charlotte might attempt. Obviously, she's had this fake document created to contest Mother's real will. Is that what you think happened, Nathaniel? That I fabricated this will? Of course that's what happened. You can't accept that Mother chose me as her primary heir. The admission was perfect. In front of a room full of family witnesses, Nathaniel had just declared that any will favoring me must be fake, a statement that would be devastating when the handwriting analysis proved my version was authentic and his was forged. But I wasn't finished yet. Nathaniel, I want you to explain something to me. You claimed you were present when Mother signed your version of the will on October 28th. But according to hospital records, Mother was unconscious in surgery from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m. that day. His confidence began to crack. The times might be wrong. Hospital records aren't always accurate. Actually, they are accurate, said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Mother's oncologist, who chose that moment to enter the dining room. I performed Eleanor's surgery that day, and she was under general anesthesia for the entire procedure. She couldn't have signed anything. Dr. Walsh's testimony had been arranged by Agent Martinez as part of the sting operation. But to the family members present, her appearance seemed perfectly natural, a doctor wanting to set the record straight about her patient's final days. Nathaniel was now visibly sweating, his hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. Dr. Walsh, you must be confused about the dates. Mother had many medical procedures. I'm not confused about anything, Mr. Peterson. What I am confused about is why you visited your mother's hospital room at 3:17 in the morning on October 28th, according to security footage, and why her condition deteriorated so rapidly after your visit. The room erupted. Family members were demanding explanations, voices raised in shock and accusation. Uncle Harold was on his feet and pointing at Nathaniel and shouting, "What did you do to Eleanor?" Gregory Whitman tried to salvage the situation. This is obviously a coordinated attack on Mr. Peterson's character. These allegations are completely unfounded.
Are they unfounded, Gregory? Agent Martinez stepped into the room, her FBI badge clearly visible. Because we have recordings of you discussing inheritance fraud schemes with known criminals, surveillance footage of you coordinating document forgeries, and financial records showing payments to witnesses who provided false testimony. The revelation that federal agents had been monitoring the situation sent shockwaves through the room. Several family members stood up in confusion, not understanding how a family dispute had become a federal investigation. But Nathaniel's reaction told everyone everything they needed to know. Instead of protesting his innocence or demanding explanations, he simply stood up and tried to walk out of the room. "Mr. Peterson," Agent Martinez said calmly, "you're under arrest for inheritance fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering, and suspicion of murder in the death of Eleanor Peterson." The word murder hit the room like a physical blow. Aunt Margaret screamed. Uncle Harold collapsed back into his chair. Gregory Whitman was also being arrested by 2 additional agents who had entered behind Agent Martinez. As federal agents placed handcuffs on my brother, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete vindication. Every family member who had questioned my character, every relative who had accepted Nathaniel's lies, every person who had made me feel like the villain in my own mother's story was now witnessing the truth. "Charlotte," Aunt Margaret said through her tears, "I'm so sorry. We should have believed you." But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Martinez addressed the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Charlotte Peterson has been working with federal investigators for weeks to expose a criminal enterprise that has victimized families across 3 states.
Her courage in pursuing the truth about her mother's death is likely saved other families from experiencing similar tragedies. As Nathaniel was led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete vindication. Every family member who had questioned my character, every relative who had accepted Nathaniel's lies, every person who had made me feel like the villain in my own mother's story was now witnessing the truth. "Charlotte," Aunt Margaret said through her tears, "I'm so sorry. We should have believed you." But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Martinez addressed the entire room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Charlotte Peterson has been working with federal investigators for weeks to expose a criminal enterprise that has victimized families across 3 states. Her courage in pursuing the truth about her mother's death is likely saved other families from experiencing similar tragedies." As Nathaniel was led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. "I'm so sorry." I couldn't have said the word. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind the Peterson family home, my home now, watching Mother's roses bloom in their 3rd spring since her death. Nathaniel had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Gregory Whitman received 12 years and permanent disbarment. Their criminal network had been dismantled, and 17 other families had recovered their stolen inheritances. Peterson Marketing Solutions now operated from a beautiful office in the historic district, expanded with the inheritance Mother had always intended for me to have. But more than the money or the property, I had something that no one could steal. The knowledge that I had honored Mother's memory by fighting for the truth, no matter how difficult the battle became. The Peterson family legacy wasn't just about the land or the house or the business success. It was about standing up for what's right, protecting the innocent, and never backing down when someone tries to erase your worth or steal your truth. And if you're facing your own battle against people who think they can silence you or steal what's rightfully yours, remember this: the truth has a way of surfacing when you're brave enough to keep digging for it. Don't let anyone convince you that fighting for justice makes you the villain. Sometimes being called difficult or dramatic or greedy is just proof that you're standing in the way of someone else's lies. Fight back, fight smart, and never, ever let them write you out of your own story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.